All right, perfect. I'm excited for this one. Normally when I interview, I don't keep my phone out with my questions, but as Butoshi said, it's a little bit more of a technical one, so I wanted to keep it out for some reasons. We've got an incredible panel. I'm very honored to be on the panel with these guys. If you don't know me, I'm Brett Herskope, Head of Community Growth at Gamma, Eli Herf on Twitter, also have my own project, The Pandemonium. We built Audio Gallery, which is very dope. Hope you've seen it. Woo! But I wasn't going to get these guys to introduce themselves because we know who they are, but we might do it just briefly anyway because who they are and what they've done is going to flow through their answers for what we ask. So rather than me introduce them, which has been done on some previous panels, I'm going to let them introduce themselves very briefly because I would love for then the questions to kind of tie into what they do and then also what might be possible on Bitcoin. So fire away.
What's up, everyone? I'm Billy Restey, a generative artist on Bitcoin, founder of BitBlocks, and my current project is Fusion, but I'm sure we'll get into that.
Hi, I'm Grace, and I've launched a few collections in the Bitcoin ecosystem, Crash Punks, Diamond Fingers, and then now building Playhouse, which is 3D animated films on Bitcoin.
Hey everyone, my name is Michael. I am the digital and visual artist behind Ephemera and Ephemera kits. So I work closely with Raph and Aaron and the rest of the Inscribing Atlantis team on that.
Hey, I'm Raph. I am the lead maintainer of Ord, which is the reference client of the Ordinals protocol. I'm also the CTO of Inscribing Atlantis. So yeah, I work with Michael and with Aaron. Yeah, I'm excited to be here, talk a little about your experience with the protocol and kind of mix my knowledge into it.
Yeah, so it's going to be really interesting to have Raph on the end of the line or at the start of the line, depending on where we start, because he's coming at it from two really unique perspectives in terms of maintaining this beautiful protocol in which, this is why we're all here, but then also his role as CTO at Inscribing Atlantis and what he's done, because that's an aspect of what he does that I'm not super familiar with. So it'll be really nice to learn about. So the first question is, well, actually, first I want to say that Erin wants this, and I'm going to respect that. She wants this to be nice and technical because we hear a lot of panels where it's like, woo, ordinals, but we want to get right into the nitty gritty of it. So we're going to get technical. It's going to be high level and technical, so it depends on, Billy will sort of give stuff that everyone will understand and then also maybe stuff that only, a niche group of you will understand. And I think that that's really important. So the first question is, at a technical level, in terms of what you've created, how does it impact your creative vision and what you have executed in terms of what's possible right now on Bitcoin?
Yeah, that last panel was great, just kind of talking about some of the limitations and file sizes, but yeah, there's some amazing stuff you can do with Bitcoin. For BitBlocks, we got the file size down to 180 bytes, but the actual file was 4 megabytes when you download it locally. So Bitcoin can be super powerful in that regard using recursion. And Ordinals bot did an amazing job building out the front-end UI where people just inscribe on demand. And they could choose any inscription on Bitcoin and inscribe their BitBlock, and that worked out really well. But that's just kind of a powerful way to get large file sizes on Bitcoin. If you were to inscribe, 4 megabytes worth of data, you're going to be paying 6 figures at least, so pretty crazy. But yeah, recursion is super powerful. I mean, essentially you're kind of building these mini websites and the front end of your browser is rendering them, and it's super powerful. Thanks to Raph and all of his contributions to the protocol, working in these endpoints that are really great for generative art. My current project, Fusion, this round where people are inscribing using any rare sat, and the rare sat generates the artwork, so that's like perfect for me. I love rare sats. I feel like that's a part of Ordinals that is so unique and different from other blockchains. You have these Satoshis, these pieces of Bitcoin that just have history. It was initially called the time chain, and it's basically the world's clock, and now, through Rodamore's creation, it's, the world's library, and I think that's super, super powerful. And one of the cool things is, you just look in one of these Ord explorers like Ordiscan, Ord.io, and you can flip and you can just see the code. Like it's all open source and you can kind of learn and see what people are doing. Like, oh, how'd Femojis do that delayed reveal? That is super innovative and cool. Well, you can look at the code. Like, oh, how did Taproot Wizards like inscribe, non-broadcasted transactions? You can look at the code and kind of see what's under the hood. And I think that's a great learning experience and also just kind of, reverse engineering how these things are being done. But yeah, I think rare and special sats, those few projects prior, we're just talking about finding these really cool sats and inscribing with them. And I feel like that's just so unique and that kind of separates Ordinals from, maybe NFTs. I think that's a powerful aspect of digital artifacts on Bitcoin.
So I've been exploring a lot on the 3D art and asset side and what we can do with that on Bitcoin. I personally, I've inscribed visual art on Bitcoin and I inscribed my music on Bitcoin. And so I was like, okay, what's next? What else can I inscribe? And so right now I've been doing a lot of 3D animated films and 3D animated music videos and exploring how to go about inscribing that. And so one of the first things that we did was inscribing some 3D katanas on Bitcoin, and that was using recursion. So basically a lot went into that because that was, again, you're dealing with like 4 megabytes and 3D is known for being pretty large file sizes. And so the technicality to be able to like get a 3D asset to be compressed so small and still looking good, and because it's going to be on chain forever, so to be able to like compress it so small, I think recursion really helps out with that, because what we did was using a combination of code as well as 3D asset, getting the 3D asset down from, it was like 3 megabytes initially and getting it down to like 230 kilobytes, and then putting that on chain and then being able to call that with some JavaScript code, and then being able to like write some shader code that combine everything together. So that's kind of like one example of what you can do. And then for some of the music stuff I've done is inscribing music on like special sats. And so you can actually, if you have like dates that are meaningful to you, you can like get a sat from that date, or just like have different like meanings attached to that sat and then inscribe your piece on that. I also experimented with like cursed ordinals at one point, and so a lot of it is just like you can think of how you want it to tie into the story and the art that you're creating, and being able to like communicate with actions that are taking place on chain using some of the endpoints.
Yeah, so I actually want to first give some props to you, Grace. I stole some of your code from the Katana thing, dug through that to figure out how to deal with the Draco compression when we were trying to get our file sizes down for Ephemera. So, and then also Billy, to your point, I mean, there's kind of like, that's the, sort of like the, what is provided to the commons, like the ability to actually get into the, the guts of every project, see how something was done, and that opens up a lot of opportunities for people to get into it. It also opens up sort of mischievous opportunities, for creators to obscure, the way that their code works, because it is a canvas, kind of to harken back to what Coldy said as well. For Ephemera, for example, it's a 3D art project similar to kind of the projects Grace has been talking about. We have a number of 3D assets inscribed as GLB files, and then those are referenced recursively and rendered and animated with 3JS and some other JavaScript libraries that then reference inscription metadata, block height, and things like that to give sort of like a, I hate to say data-driven because it sounds, a little square compared to what's kind of the stuff actually is, but, to really like have a deep tie between the medium and what it's communicating.
Yeah, so my kind of approach to this whole kind of Bitcoin as a canvas, like I spent the last 2 years more on the low-level protocol of Ordinals, coding together with Casey, spending a lot of time with Bitcoin, trying to figure out how to, create the canvas everyone can use here. And and then over the last year, I've also, started helping artists, like onboard them and actually see how artists want to use this canvas. So I myself was then exploring the thing that I helped create. And like, I learned a lot through that, okay, you want to do this, I should write some like helper function or some like way to test stuff. For example, we have this nice command in Ord, it's called ordenv, where if you want to test out how to, test different recursion, test different things, you can just spin up like a small local Bitcoin node, small local Ord node, and like will do everything for you, and then you can inscribe and test before you actually push it onto mainnet. So my whole thing was like just building tools for the artists to like better be able to use and like utilize this canvas. And now with the Ephemera project that I'm working with Michael and Aaron on is not only am I inscribing, but I'm creating like this whole kind of experience and application around it. And that has been very fun. It's a very fun like creative outlet, because what it really does, it really makes it concrete. Like if you create like from end to end, like a whole like cool, nice experience of like from like buying the art to like seeing the art to interacting with it. And overarching, I think this really kind of helps making Bitcoin more concrete. Like generally money is a very kind of abstract thing. It's very difficult to grasp. And we like money because we can do concrete things with it. And I think Ordinals is kind of this Trojan horse of like, oh, I can do stuff with it. And then people start using Ordinals, and then they start using Bitcoin. Because I've also talked to some people here, they've only come to the Inscribing Nashville conference. They're not going to the Bitcoin conference. They came here because they're interested in in Ordinals and want to see the Ordinals conference. And because they use Ordinals, by default, they also use Bitcoin. So it's been very beautiful to kind of see, and getting more people into Bitcoin kind of through Ordinals and all the art that you guys create.
I really like the friction on Bitcoin. I feel like it pushed me to be more creative, think outside of the box, and kind of really figure out what I was doing. Like I like the friction. Like you literally can't make a diamond without pressure.
Yeah, you also have to kind of trust your users that they can understand a little bit of complexity, that they might understand what a UTXO is, and like maybe surface it, like to show like users, oh, you have UTXOs. You not only have an address, no, like underlying thing that Bitcoin has is a UTXO. So like, slowly kind of educate people and kind of surface up the complexity that is underneath.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people, they do want to just kind of show up to a website, hit mint, and then make generational wealth. I'm for that as well. That's great. But I feel like my projects, and thanks for those who have stuck with me, like I do like that friction, and I pass that on to the user. Like I do want it to be a learning experience. You're hunting, you're finding your own Satoshi that you want to inscribe with. Maybe it's like a birth date, and then you have to inscribe it yourself. I mean, with Ordinals Bot, we built tools. It's like 4 clicks, but like you're the one actually doing that, and I think that's a learning opportunity. And I think we can't lose sight of like the cool nature of like how Ordinals kind of differentiates itself and digital artifacts.
Well, just thinking about the constraints, because I'm right now working on a lot of 3D animated films using Three.js, and so we're building tools for filmmakers, music artists, and other creatives to be able to create like Pixar animation films on Bitcoin, and thinking through the constraints of all of that. And so, for example, in our scene, it'll be like shown here after the talk, but in our scene, one of the examples is like how we would go about like inscribing the animated characters, or how we would go about inscribing the 3D model. Sometimes the 3D model might be too large, but then like one aspect that you can think about with regards to the constraint is just like, okay, well, you can just like work with a cube. In Three.js, you can just like start off with like a cube, and then let's say you want to construct a building or something, that you can just like recursively call that cube and make it into a building instead of like making a 3D model of a building. So that's kind of like another way to go about it when you're thinking about the constraints on Bitcoin.
I'd actually like to just hop in one more time. We've heard a decent number of times people have mentioned the file size constraints on Ordinals, and these are certainly very challenging. It was like, I think over the first couple months of Ephemera, this is like one of the sticking points. This is one of the classic things where I would give a time estimate, and then we would go over it by a factor of 10. But I want to speak to those file sizes a little bit, because I think it actually kind of connects digital artists with a little bit of like an older tradition in digital art. And so just for an example, thinking about old video games, which are some of the most potent examples of clever bit packing and really judicious kind of file size kung fu. Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, which especially for its time was an extremely expansive game. The entire thing is less than 32 megabytes. A lot of contemporary video games, I think one example that comes to mind, for example, is like Final Fantasy 15. When you download this and you get all of the assets that power the game, you're on the hook for over 100 gigabytes. Why does this happen? Is it because it's that many times more expansive, more comprehensive, more immersive than Ocarina of Time? Perhaps not. It also happens because the 3D assets that go into a lot of contemporary video games are not lovingly handcrafted and pared down to their most essential vertices and faces and textures, but rather someone, a dev under like a serious time crunch will download a, coffee cup from, I don't know, Turbo Squid or whatever, pay $80 for it. And this thing is like itself like a couple hundred megabytes. They don't optimize it because they don't need to, because file sizes are cheap now, and they just throw it in there. And so then the overall like payload of the game and kind of like the meaning of that becomes very separated from the content of the game itself. Whereas the sorts of tricks that people had to do in like early generation video games, they were immersed in the file loaders. They were immersed in like making new file formats. They were immersed in like, how do I make a font as small as possible? How do I make this model as small as possible? How do I reuse the same, I'm gonna probably harken back to Legend of Zelda a couple times. Like, it's very, very interesting to look at the, sort of like bitmap images that they used to texture like the character Sheik, for example. They have like one tiny part of this image that they tile all over the character and use it in different ways for different things. And these are the kinds of constraints, like these form the medium. We don't make the medium within or around these. This is the medium. The medium, to sort of use a cliche, the medium is the message, right? Like inscriptions are art about inscriptions. They're art about Bitcoin. Movies are art about movies. TV is art about TV. And because it is so difficult and cost prohibitive to put large files on the blockchain, it presents and forces an opportunity to actually like engage with digital files. And that is like a dying art. I mean, you hear horror stories that like Zoomers don't know what like a file or a folder is. They're like, well, where is it on my iPad? And so, it's interestingly like it's a way to join kind of a time-honored tradition.
I'd love to make one quick meta point on the stuff you said, is that I think like great art lives through constraints. Like you need the constraints to kind of force the artist to distill until you find the essence of what you're trying to create. And Bitcoin is very good at that. It's a very constrained system. It's a very constrained canvas, but it really forces you to think very carefully about what you want to include. Like don't like fill it up with a lot of fluff. Like really try to figure out what is the essence of this thing that I want to create, and then you bring it on chain and then you create it.
Yeah, no, Solana's a perfect example of this. Like if it's too cheap, it will just get spammed with anything and everything. I do like that, again, I mentioned friction earlier, but it's expensive block space. You do have to think about what you're going to embed into the blockchain because it's going to be there forever. And I'm kind of glad it's expensive because you have to put more thought into it. There's only been 20 gigabytes inscribed thus far, which is just insane.
Yeah, I love to think of the transaction cost or the inscribing cost as a bullshit filter. Like anything that's bullshit it's just too expensive to do, so you won't do it. That's the thesis.
There's a time and place for bullshit. They're like Solana like the sort of ecosystem around Solana and like the sort of like bullshit churning out machine, that has like appeared in that ecosystem, again, like that speaks to the medium of Solana, and like things that are effective in that ecosystem are the ones that speak to that medium. Ephemera, for example, would not make sense as a Solana project because like it does come from like that sort of like judicious sense, of care for the assets themselves. And there's a time and place for that, and hopefully like a deep time, kind of a deeper place for that, and like thinking about longevity and legacy. But that being said, I mean, like, the sort of like grand shitpost factory, of things like Solana, like that is a very like potent like petri dish, where like a lot of stuff is I don't know, I guess festering, but it's meaningful in its sort of like reverse meaningful way. And so like I think it's like wherever you are, you honor the medium.
It's the primordial soup before we made it onto land.
I love this. This panel moderates itself. I'm not really even required up here. But am I here? But this is perfect. This is why I knew this was a great panel. And when I saw who I was on stage with, I was, like I said, very honored. Yeah, it's interesting. Like every byte costs, every kilobyte costs, every megabyte costs. And so that I think that's really important, and it just adds to that. Raph, we'll start with you on this one. Obviously, like you said, you're involved with the creation of the protocol, and then you've been maintaining it, implementing endpoints and whatnot. Do you think about what's possible or what might be created when you're doing it? How do you go through that process? And then we'll go through each of the creators. And you can also touch on Ephemera with Michael. People use the cliche that we're only scratching the surface. Do you believe that, or do you think that there's a lot more possibilities? And what else do you think we can do?
So yeah, like the recursive endpoints, like the most basic recursive endpoint is you can reference any other inscription that is on chain. Like that's the one that's used the most. That's the one that's most useful because then you can basically build it all together. And then there's like another class of recursive inscriptions which are meant to like deepen that. Oh, anything on Bitcoin you can reference. It's like referencing the block height or referencing the block hash, so you can like use a little bit of randomness in your generative art. And basically the underlying kind of thesis or philosophy of these recursive endpoints is to at some point make everything that is on Bitcoin available to all inscriptions. And the path towards that is like very slow, like slowly adding new endpoints, because at a kind of technical or from a maintenance perspective, these endpoints have very, very strict backwards compatibility guarantees, which means once they're set, once they have a specific format, and once they have a specific name, they can never be changed, because all of the inscriptions that reference them are on-chain, unchangeable, immutable, and can always have to have, talk to the same endpoint, expect the same thing. So like me as the maintainer, every time like people make new proposals for endpoints, I have to think very carefully about how to implement them, and implement them in such a way that they're like future compatible. Especially if you think on these like extremely long time frames that we all hope Bitcoin will live on. Basically, that's the kind of thing you have to think about when maintaining these endpoints. And from a perspective of when I add and how I add, basically, yeah, people come with proposals, or I talk to artists and they're like, oh, I'd love to, for example, there was this one project where they wanted to have the color change according to how high the fee rate is, similar to when you go to mempool.space, like the blocks turn like dark purple if the fees very high, if the fees are very high. So I was like, okay, let's add an endpoint called the r/r/block info endpoint, which returns a bunch of statistics about a block, including, of course, the fee rate percentiles. So then people can now talk to that endpoint, and in their inscription, they can like, yeah, make the color change if the fee rates are high. But there's also other statistics in there, like about all the stuff, that a block can contain. So that's a good example of like one thing I added. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like to speak to, I guess like what is, or like what might be pushing the limits, where those limits might be, like what's scratching the surface. I guess actually like, I hope this addresses the question, but like one thing that I want to touch on, with regards to immutability, with regards to like longevity of the art. One thing that's very interesting with HTML, JavaScript, especially, things that actually get into like using a little bit more sophisticated rendering technology like, WebGL and things like that. The assets that actually make this art like, visible or navigable, usable, these are not yet permanent. There is no, reference copy of Google Chrome and all of its, dependencies on chain right now. And that means that, if we take this future archaeological standpoint, 500, 1,000 years from now, aliens or future, archaeologists are recovering a whole bunch of, largely partially corrupted hard drives of, like full nodes that have all of this data on them. They may not be able to render the original artwork if it is, some of these like recursive, like live rendering kinds of things. I think this is like the nature of producing, really anything, and the nature of accepting. I think Aaron mentioned earlier today that like we are creating ruins. We're creating like, we're creating like bodies of work that someday will be skeletons, someday will be fossils. And the way that we have sought to, leave those bones behind with Ephemera, for example, is tying it back to something that is going to be permanent, and that's the planetary metadata. The cherry on top of that is like the currently enjoyable 3D interactive stuff, which, hopefully increasing awareness and interest and engagement in these kinds of projects, might lead in the future to like a large scale project of inscribing a fully featureful browser, that can actually like reference all of that stuff it needs to on chain, such that it will be preserved. But, I think one of the exciting things about pushing the platform is that in some ways, we're thinking about what's going to break, and we're preparing for it to break and leaving something that is like beautiful even when it's broken.
Yeah, I think we're just only scratching the surface of what's possible. 3 years ago, I wanted to build a metaverse on Bitcoin, and the technologies weren't possible for that yet. But now I think there is more of a the technologies for that are becoming like coming into existence right now with like WebGL and like bitmaps and like with more things that we can do on Bitcoin, and also some of like the AI stuff. And so that is a lot of what I'm exploring and really like trying to push the envelope on. And then with regards to music as well, that's only becoming possible now too, because I inscribed my music on Bitcoin. I was really exploring like different ways to go about doing that without losing audio quality. And so that is still pretty challenging because most songs are going to be way larger, and unless you have a large budget to inscribe it, it's not possible. But then for kind of like some of the explorations that I was doing was either you can just like inscribe like audio samples or stems, and now there's like an Ordinals project which is building a DAW on Bitcoin, which kind of like creates more possibilities. But before that tech was ready, it was very much just like me kind of like slicing up the song and compressing it, just like finding the right balance. But then there's still more that I want to do with it, right? Because like now that my music is on chain, I'm actually creating Playhouse.ai to make like a 3D animated music video that's on Bitcoin. And that's kind of like exploring possibilities for what music artists can do on Bitcoin and be able to like monetize their work, monetize their art. And so, and so like I'm kind of really interested in more media entertainment use cases on Bitcoin and enabling that. And then there's also more interactive possibilities. So you talked about Ephemera, and that's like one example, but there's so many different things that you can do with the endpoints and being able to like communicate on chain, and also enabling actions to take place in the future. So maybe it's like a block that's happening in the future, and maybe you want to have a conversation with the future. And so maybe you can think of what you're working on as like a time capsule. And so if you program that interactivity, then maybe 100 years later, then you're talking, you're leaving, you have maybe some kind of like chat bot on chain that is chatting with people, your descendants in the future or something. So there's still a lot of really cool things that we can explore. Back in 2017, I was working with brain activity, and I was working on like brain-computer interfaces. And so I actually want to put my brain activity on chain. And now we have another project with Neuro who's doing that. And so there's still so many things that we can explore putting on chain.
Yeah, it's crazy how far we've come in such a short amount of time. I see technology, I see AI, I see everything kind of progressing even more rapidly than ever. But stuff you can do today on Bitcoin, we didn't have those endpoints to create generative art. We didn't have recursion, when the Node Monks collection dropped. It's crazy. Thank you for adding that. But no, it's really, really cool to think about, and I'll keep it brief, but the world is your oyster. Inscribe your legacy on Bitcoin. To me, Bitcoin is one of the only things permanent in my life. So when people are like, I hope it's around, I'm like, oh, it's going to be around. But yeah, put your legacy on chain. That's all I got.
No, that was great. We could have easily kept going. We definitely need to wrap up there. I think let's give these pioneers of the digital megalith a big clap. And of course, for our brilliant creators, but let's just give Raph like an extra round of applause because. Yeah. I think when the Trisolarans get here, they're going to be quite proud of what we've achieved. So let's keep it up. Good on you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you.